Okay, I want to show you how to do a merge in SPSS that keeps only the cases that are in both files. So by default in SPSS, it's going to do basically what's called an outer join, which means it's going to keep all the cases from both files, whether each is in the other file or not. So it's going to keep all the cases. There's a lot of times where when you're doing a merge, you only want to keep the cases that are in both, only the cases that are in common from both files. And by default, SPSS is not going to do that. So there's like a two-step process for doing a merge that will keep only the cases that are in common in both files. Quickly, let's look at these quick little sample files and see kind of what I mean. I've got here just a customer file with some customer numbers and info, and then I have this address file that has some customer addresses. But notice there's a customer here that it doesn't exist in the customer file, and there's a couple in this file, 222 and 999, that don't exist in this file. So it's going to pull all of those in, even if they don't exist in both. The only other thing we want to do, and I've already sorted these, so if you're doing this, make sure you sort your files by the primary key or important merging key before you do it. The only other thing we want to do before we start is just take a quick look at the number of cases in each. So this has 8 cases in it, and this has 7 cases in it. So you might say with these we can merge and then eyeball it and see which ones weren't in and remove those. But I was doing this with some files that had like 35,000 records in them or cases in them. And there's no way you want to dig through all those and try to figure out which ones were in one and which ones were not in the other. So with this method I'm going to show you, you can have that, do all that in SPSS. So like I said, there's a two-step process. The first step is we're going to do the merge using the syntax window. So I'm going to do File, New Syntax. And then basically here is the code. It's a little bigger and easier to read, so I just want to put it here. Basically here's the code we need. We have the first file, second file, merging variables, and then I like to save the output into a new file, so that's why I have this additional line here. One other note, I like to use like fully qualified paths and file names, so that's what you see here. If you don't like to do that, that's fine. And I'm using a virtual machine, that's why this file path looks a little weird, but in the second example, I'll show you a basic file path that has like C desktop or whatever. The other thing I need to mention that I don't think I've mentioned yet is if you're doing this merge where you want to keep only the records in common, it's going to be slightly different if you're doing a one-to-one merge versus a one-to-many merge. So the syntax is going to be very small, but it's going to be an important difference, and your merges won't work if you don't do it right. So the first one we're doing here is a one-to-one where we have one set of customers, all the customers appear in that file once, and in the addresses, they also only appear in there once. So we've got the first file here, customer sort, second file address. If you have multiple fields that you're merging on, notice you can note multiple key fields, you just list them all with a space between them. In this example, we just have one primary key field, and it's just customer num, so I'm just going to put that in here. And I'm going to call my out file merge one-to-one since we're going to do a one-to-many after this. The other key with this, or important thing with this merge that we're doing here, is we're creating some flag variables. And these are going to be important to know which records were in the customer file, which records were in the address file, and then we can use these flag variables to keep only the ones that were in both. So this little n with these variables is very important. And the name you give these variables is just arbitrary, and it's up to you. These are kind of just some temporary flag fields that will use or be used in SPSS, but aren't really super important for your final data set. So I call this one in customer, and I call this one in addie. All right, let's just paste this into that syntax window and run it. So this is the syntax you need to do this. All right, I think that worked. Let's look at our merge file. So this is the important sort of structure of what just happened. Notice we can see the one case that was in the address file, so it's got information in the address file, but it wasn't in the customer file. And we see a couple cases that were in the customer file, but they weren't in the address file. So this is easy to eyeball, but if we had thousands and thousands of records, we would not want to go through that. So that's where these two fields come in. Notice the 0 for in customer and a couple zeros for in address. So if we want to keep only the ones that were in both, we just want to say keep the ones that have in cust equals 1 and in addie equals 1. So that's the second step when I said this is kind of a two-step process. So the second step to this process, I've got my merge file here, which I call merge one-to-one. I'm just going to do data, select cases, and I'm going to use those two flag fields to get my final data set that only has cases in common. So I'm going to do an if condition. You can either type your if condition manually, or I'm going to use the editor to do it. So I'm going to say in cust equals 1. And again, you can type this in if you want instead of using these buttons. And in addie equals 1. So now as this select cases, we're only going to select the cases where in cust is 1 and in addie is 1. Those are my two flag variables. And instead of filtering, I like to just create a new data set. So I'm going to call this, I'll call it MRG 121 in common or something, whatever. So here's my merged in common data set. Notice now we only have those 6 cases out of the 8 and 7 that were in both. And we can kind of verify with those flag fields. So that's all there really is to it. The syntax that I showed you for the merge, creating those variables, and then doing that select cases using those variables to get a final data set with just the records that are in both. And again, if you had thousands of records, this would be the way to do it without having to look through all those. Now, the one-to-many is going to be slightly different, not much different, but just enough that I want to show you that so that you don't get errors and warnings and stuff and basically bad data if you're trying to do a one-to-many where you only want to keep cases that are in both. Let me close up a couple of these data sets. I'm going to keep my customers open, but I'm going to open a different file that has some transactions in it. So we have one customer, but they might have many transactions, or they could have multiple transactions. So we're going to get a one-to-many situation. So I got my transaction file, and it's already sorted by the customer number. And we won't look at this too closely, but basically we could have one customer here, but could have multiple transactions. So now we're getting a one-to-many. And again, we might have some transactions here that don't have a customer, and we probably have some customers here, like 888, that don't have a transaction. So typically the SPSS is still going to pull all those in, so that's why we're doing this. So again, let's do the, I don't know if it matters, but I'm going to click on this one to do the one side of it. So the only real difference here is, really the only difference at all is this keyword, table instead of file. So basically what we're seeing here is exact same as what we saw here, except instead of file and file, now we're going to do table and file, with the table being the one, sort of the lookup table, and the file being the many. Okay? So I need to, and I was just showing also the, this is another way to do the file path, that because the other one really isn't applicable because it's a virtual machine. So this would be like a fully qualified file path and file name with a file somewhere on your PC. I'm actually going to copy the other one because I'm still using the virtual machine, and we'll just change a couple things. So this needs to be keyword table. This file name is the same, customer, but now we're merging with that transactions file. We're merging on one, but again, if you had multiple, just list them with a space in between each. Let's call this one one to many. And same idea. Really, there's this is, the rest is all the same as what I've already shown you in this video, other than this being the difference, and the table being the one side and the file being the many side. But this time I'm going to call my flag variables unaddy and nt and tran. And again, the second step will be still removing those duplicates. Alright, so here's our merged one to many. Same principle here. We've got some transactions that don't have a customer. Looks like maybe the way the one to many worked, it didn't pull in the customers that didn't have transactions. But again, we can use our flag variables to keep only the ones that are in both. So we're just going to use these two flag variables. So the second step with your finished merged file is to do data, select cases, and make sure both your flags equal 1. And I'll just call this XYZ since we're almost finished here. And now that gives us a file. Again, if you had thousands or hundreds of records, this would give us a file using those two flags where we only have cases that were in both of those. First example I showed you was one-to-one. And the second example I showed you was a one-to-many.